as you record, two things.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm making you do TA role. I apologize.
You've
Two
helped me a few
things.
times. Come on. All right.
Okay. So first is pin your screen. So if you go to participants, right on top or at the bottom,
Uh-huh.
you as the host, there should be somewhere that says more.
Yeah, I've got participants. It's got me, and then you as co-host, and Formato and Gaides, and then all. That's
Where
all. Go ahead.
where it has your name, if you put your cursor around there, there should be three dots, three horizontal dots that say more, and then you should
Yeah,
be able to.
I just
So
clicked on. I clicked on more. So what do I do now?
pin screen. There should be pin pin this screen.
Yeah, all
It's not giving.
it has rename and add profile picture. So that's not it.
It's
Okay,
not
the
giving
little.
you.
Okay, there's a little dot that shows me it's recording, but that's all I have. Like by my
Oh my.
name. I've got mute and more.
Yeah, click on more.
Click on more, and all it has is rename or add profile picture.
Okay. Are you on speaker view or gallery view?
I guess I'm on gallery view.
So it's showing all the screens at once. I do apologize for this. It's.
Oh, that's okay. But let's get it squared away so we can record.
I mean, it's already recording. What I'm trying to do is, if we leave it this way, it's gonna be showing everybody's screen in the video. So it's gonna
Yeah,
be showing like 6 different screens and not just you.
yeah,
Eventually, when the guys watch it. So
yeah,
typically, what we do is we pin the screen so that it shows just you. That's what I'm trying to get. For whatever reason, my laptop is not coming on. It's just turning around. Let's just record and continue. I'll
yeah.
apologize to the guys later for that.
Oh, no problem. And I understand what you're trying to do, but given there's just 4 of us, that won't be too distracting. It's not like there's 20 guys out there. So
Yeah,
anyway.
Let's just and
Oh
then I'll
wait,
find a way to get the recording from you.
wait a minute. I've got to. What about if I click on view here?
Okay.
Okay, speaker view. That's what you want me to do.
Yeah.
Yep, I got it. I got it to speaker view.
Okay, I think that should help.
Okay, I got it. Figured it out. So I'm on speaker view now. Thank you, Paul. No problem.
Yes.
Okay, so does anybody want to give me a quick snapshot of Tom Nichols? What did you find out about him? What does he do? What qualifies him to write this book? Anybody want to tell us that?
Is he an academic kind of guy? I read the book when we first got it, but I'm trying to remember something like an academic and things like that.
He is. He's been involved with the government. Do you know where he presently works or where he worked at the time of the writing of this book?
Was it Harvard?
Well, he has a Harvard education, but he works at the U.S. Naval War College. And
Okay.
He's been an expert in Soviet relations, and so he has a very interesting background. Well, I want us to focus on the introduction and at least the first chapter today. I'll just give a quick overview. I'm not certainly going to read the book, but I'm just going to make some comments and then bring you guys in. In the preface of this book, he says expertise is in trouble and that the United States is obsessed with the worship of its own ignorance. We're proud, it seems, as a culture of not knowing things. And then he even quotes from the original government documents, the Bill of Rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We're familiar with that phrase, but now he says it's not these truths, but all truths are self-evident, even the ones that aren't true. All things are now knowable, and every opinion on any subject is as good as any other. So the first question would be, do you agree with that? Do you think, is that true to your experience and what you observe? What about it, Formato?
If we were to open it to that and hold it as something that is the foundation, therefore, to me, I would see as Christianity just being another view, not necessarily something that is the truth, but just a form of a truth. And so I've seen kind of back in another seminary, we saw it as the domestication of Christianity, where when Christianity was the core foundation, it was very engaging to the culture and society. It has now become like a stream of, like, kind of like a stream below the culture, but the culture having its own views on top of what is truth with a capital T,
Yeah,
not
yeah.
lowercase t.
Totally agree with you. But is your perception just of the culture we live in today, the American culture? Would you agree with his assessment that people are almost proud of their ignorance?
Yes.
Yeah. What about it, Gaidi? Would you agree with that?
Well, I'm looking at it from maybe a different perspective, and I want to attack it like this, from a Christianity standpoint, and as from a pastoral standpoint, preaching to the masses, be it on Facebook, Google, whatever, excuse me, YouTube or what have you. There's always in the back of my mind this phrase that I've heard in the last 7 years: my truth. Okay, I've heard that so often until I'm cognizant of it while I'm preaching. So I think that in the age of social media, where we have Google and other search engines and things like that, I'm around more and more people who want to debunk what I'm saying from a preaching standpoint, who want to debunk my perspective. And if you'd allow me to say this, there in the African American culture are many people who push back at Christianity now because of some nefarious things that have taken place in America. And we know that. Okay, so now what I'm saying doesn't have the same weight to the masses as it would have 20 years ago.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah.
Google has done those things, Wikipedia, you name it. So I don't know if I would agree with the people celebrating ignorance. I think people, based on the title of his book, everyone now in a real sense has become an expert at a moment's notice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it may be I totally resonate with what you're saying. I was thinking as I was reading this book, it's like really what he's saying is that so many people today are ignorant of their ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
And go back to what Fermato said, if there's no agreed upon standard, it's just your truth and my truth, and one's as good as the other, well, then you've opened the door for chaos. Now, that leads him to make a statement, and it really made me think about where we are as a culture. And regardless of where one is, whether one was pro-Trump, anti-Trump, pro-Biden, anti-Biden, I think this is absolutely, he puts his finger on the pulse of where we are today. Today, he says, and this was written in 2017, Americans tend not only to dismiss expertise, but they dismiss it with anger. And then he goes on to write, remember in the book, he's saying, today with modern technology, Gaidi, you've referenced it, 30 years ago, people didn't have search engines, Wikipedia, they didn't have it. And we have this glut of information, and it's threatening to people. It's not like I'm living out on the farm, let's chop the wood, and let's pour the water and all those things. It's threatening to people. And so there's this anger and there's this resentment. Mm-hmm. Then that is coupled, he puts his finger on that idea of narcissism. We're a narcissistic culture where we think we know it all, we're the best, the be all and end all. And it creates this foment of resentment. Mm-hmm. And just a personal observation here. I think we see this not only when it comes to public policy or social issues, but you see it even in the office holders. And whether one is a dyed-in-the-wool Trump supporter or can't stand him, I think objectively we can look and see that his method of communication, be it Twitter or with the media, was completely lacking in civility. And, what the leaders do, the followers do. I'm not even talking about any position that he or any other politician. I'm just talking about method of communication, Twitter communication. You see that almost anger. Are y'all with me? You understand what I'm saying? Would you concur with that? Yeah. I mean, so there is this lack of civility that's rooted in a resentment that people have. So he writes in the preface, this is a good point. He writes for the purpose and hope of bridging the gap between experts and lay people. Well, when I read that, I thought, man, I sure hope he defines what he means by expert, and as you know, if you've read the book, he does that. And I think he does it in a pretty adequate way. So let's talk about the first chapter, The Death of Expertise. And he begins with the Isaac Asimov quote, related to the cult of ignorance, and then goes into a discussion of anti-intellectualism. So let's stop and park there. Fermato and Gaidi and Paul, the truth is, where you are right now, you guys in your education is far, far beyond the average American. I think I saw something a couple of years back that the average American has the equivalent of about an 8th or a 9th grade education. So most of the people you and I know have at least a high school education. A significant number of them have some college hours or a college degree. And the point I'm getting at is, I remember experiencing this a little bit, but I think it's more pronounced maybe today, an anti-intellectualism. We talked about that in the Southern Baptist Preaching Seminar, Gaidi. So you remember that historically. But my point is, do you see that today? Do you guys have people in your lives that are going, man, Fermato or Guy, why are you doing all this advanced education? They're almost suspicious of it. Let's discuss. Go ahead, Guy.
Let me jump in, if you don't mind.
Please.
That conversation has come up more often than I'll ever admit, and I'll do it here. One of which, this is the refrain that I hear: if God called you to preach, you don't need seminary. Now, that was just for an MDiv or even an undergraduate degree. I don't even bring up the PhD as often. If people know about it, that's fine. But I don't even bring it up, because there's a sense of, can we trust you? Okay. You're stifling the spirit, the Baptist cemetery as opposed to the Baptist seminary. And so that's the one. But then beyond that, in many churches, there are preachers who have a rhetorical gift, if you will, an innate gift to just, if you just listen to what they're saying, it's not much, but the way they say it is it's powerful. So you have those guys who push back on the educational aspect. Okay. And so it's a fight. It really is. It's almost like, the little boy in the classroom who knows the answer, but he refuses to raise his hand because he doesn't want to be classified as a nerd, almost.
Exactly. Well, he makes the statement in the book that the perspective a lot of people have is, my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge, and so thus the anti-intellectualism. What about in your experience, Fermato? Have you countered anti-intellectualism?
Yeah, so kind of what Gaidi was talking about, how, if you're called to ministry, you just serve in the church and the church will ordain you and you're good to go. And so whenever I was kind of hearing opposing views of, you don't need to go to seminary, just go to, a church and they'll train you and they'll give you the tools and skills that you need to really be an effective minister. So when I kind of ended up leaving out or moving out of that type of environment from a mega church into a smaller Baptist church of like 30 people, and the majority of them were in their 80s and 90s, my pastor was, at the time, he told me, you need to go to Southwestern. And so I was a little, still being kind of new in terms of ministry and what to do and theology and grounding my faith and studying. Um, when my pastor told me that, I was a little hesitant of I don't know if you're just trying to like appease your your alma mater in terms of going to the school where you graduated back in the 70s. And so I was a little hesitant, but it's because of the culture that I came from that mega church into a small SBC church, that I was like, I don't know if I should trust you, or
Yeah.
you're just trying to shove down like a school down my throat.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well,
so I heard those, like, I heard the argument of, well, the apostles didn't need seminary, and Peter, didn't finish his, I guess, Sanhedrin education or whatever. And so well, not Peter, Paul. And so for me, it was kind of like, well, if the apostles were able to minister and bring so many people to Christ, and they didn't need a seminary education, then I don't need one either. And so then I was comparing myself to the early church period, in terms of that. And I really wrestled. And in terms of, as soon as I was reaching the end of my bachelor's degree, I was praying, and I just felt the conviction of God just telling me, you need to just ground your understanding of the Bible and of theology and just history, church history. And through prayer and just having my pastor constantly just ministering to me, he's like, you need to prepare yourself for opposing views, instead of you just being so open to so many views of Christianity, bearing the name of Christianity but are not Christian. And so that really convicted me, and so that's why I ended up deciding to come.
Yeah. Well, that's that. Appreciate you sharing that. Yes. I and we're going to get into this later. What I run into is, well, wait a minute. Spurgeon didn't go to seminary. Matt Chandler doesn't have advanced degrees. And my response is to look right back at him and say, you think you're Spurgeon? You think you're Matt Chandler? I would argue that those guys were and are unusually gifted, unusually disciplined. I mean, I'd like to say, I don't need to go to seminary. I can study Greek and Hebrew, and I can study all the disciplines, systematic theology, ethics, all those things on my own. I'll get with a couple of respected mentors, and I'll devise a plan. For me, that would never work, because I don't have the intellect or the discipline to do that. Like 98% of most people. And so that's usually how I answer that. But what both of you guys are talking about, I think, validates what Nichols is writing about in this book, The Anti-Intellectualism. And then, of course, Nichols will tip his hand to this fact too. Sometimes the problem with that anti-intellectualism is on the academic community, because Paul knew that knowledge puffs up. And when people a lot of times get information or get a certain degree of knowledge, they become arrogant. And inevitably in the institutions of higher learning, both in Europe and now in the United States, you see they don't naturally drift to the right, they drift to the left, don't they? So I think you make some really great observations. Well, he gives us some pretty good examples. I thought it was interesting. He refers to the president of South Africa in the AIDS. You remember the AIDS? Well, some of you guys are too young to remember this. In the AIDS epidemic. You remember the AIDS? Well, some of you guys are too young. In the AIDS epidemic. Okay, I'm hearing myself. We know why that's happening, Paul? I don't now. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Well, we'll proceed. Anyway, I was referring to the president of South Africa with the AIDS epidemic. And essentially, the president bought into the idea that AIDS was not caused by a virus, and therefore he rejected offers of drugs and therapies in the midst of the AIDS crisis in South Africa. The result was 300,000 people died, and at least 35,000 HIV positive babies were born. And even after that, he continued to reject the to reject the advice of the so-called experts, the scientists of the day. Now, Nichols goes on to point out, guys, that the experts are not always right, but most of the time there's merit to what they recommend, the counsel that they offer. So that was interesting. He goes on to ask people to talk about the growing ignorance in America. Did you see the section about where he tells about Americans being asked to identify Ukraine on a map, and only 1 in 6 Americans could identify Ukraine on a map? And I thought to myself, can you all identify, if we gave you a map, can you identify Ukraine? I could maybe get in the general region.
Yeah.
But here's what's fascinating. Remember, in probably 2016 or so, early in Trump's term as president, the issue was, with Putin and with Ukraine and the former Soviet Union, should Americans invade? And what they found was enthusiasm for intervention in the Ukraine was in direct proportion to a lack of knowledge about Ukraine. Fascinating. That is to say, people don't even know where this place is on a map. They can't identify any of its significant leaders or the issues involved, but they're the most gung-ho about engaging American military. I thought that was a killer argument. Really, really fascinating. And we'll have time, if not today, certainly next time. Guys, there's a lot of intersections with this book and what we do as preachers, because it's not like you and I have all the answers, but I mean, the truth is, practically speaking, why have you been in seminary, and why did I go to seminary? Why are you working on advanced degrees if it's not your hope to know as much as you can about the biblical text, not only for yourself, but to help others? And I see this in churches today, and please understand me, the goal, I'm not setting myself up or want you to set yourself up as the be all, end all, and know all. But guys, y'all know there's a lot of ignorance out there in the church, and people that think they know the Bible and think they know what it says. Sadly, they often grossly mishandle it or misinterpret it, don't they? And they often do it. Not only because of a lack of formal education, but they think they're really wise in the scriptures when they're actually pretty ignorant. Okay, does that make sense? And I see that connection there. So that's on page 2. How about this statement, the bottom of page 2? Americans have never had so much access to knowledge, and yet been so resistant to learning anything. Gaidi, earlier you mentioned Google, Wikipedia. We're going to talk about that. I generally would agree with that. We have, I mean, it's remarkable. Can you imagine 100 years ago? There's a major wreck and pileup in Fort Worth this morning, and literally within minutes of that thing happening, I can take my phone, which is really a mini computer. I can push a couple of buttons and watch video of that wreck.
Yeah.
I mean, not only the scope or the scope of information, not only the magnitude of information, but the immediacy of that information is what I'm after. Like we talked about earlier. When I was in seminary, if I wanted to listen to one of my favorite preachers, I had to call a 1-800 number and order a cassette tape. But right now, in 2 minutes, I can Google, plug in, any current pastor, and I'm watching his last Sunday morning service. So
right.
I would agree with that. Never have we had so much access to knowledge, but I think our culture is pretty resistant to learning anything. Go ahead, Gaidi.
Well, I think that, and I was reading that, and it's a double-edged sword. For instance, it's a benefit, it's convenient You talk about your college days. When I was at college early on, Prairie View, we wanted to interview for a company at a company. They told us always know something about that company. Well, we had to go to the library days before just to, get the high points. Now, let me, I can be in the interviewing room, just kind of hit a couple of buttons and get a couple of high marks there and just kind of throw them out in an interview. But that's the benefit and that's the convenience. But on the flip side, and I shouldn't say the flip side, it should force the preacher to do his homework, because no longer can you stand up and just say, well, Paul, was on the road to Damascus, or you may even get something wrong. Just have a memory lapse and say, yeah, Paul at the burning bush, and somebody, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. I mean, they can just Google what you're saying and almost do an instantaneous fact check. So a lot of times the old preacher will get up dogmatically. You can't do that. You shouldn't do that. You should make sure you are factual as best as we can be.
Yeah, I'm glad you used that phrase, fact check, now because of the availability of information, the access to it.
Yeah.
We ought to be accurate out of a desire to, rightly divide the word of God, for God's glory. But also, in light of our audience, we don't want to, if they can't trust us in the illustration, are they going to trust us when we're doing the explanation?
Sure.
And, I think I mentioned you guys, I teach a large Sunday school class at First Baptist Dallas. And in that class, I have doctors, lawyers, federal judges, people with massive amounts of education. I remember when I first started teaching the class, it was a little bit intimidating. I mean, I know you teach and preach whether someone has a third grade education or they have multiple degrees, and we're doing it for the Lord, but at the same time, your audience, you have to be sensitive to it. And I remember early on, I can't remember the subject. I think I referenced something historically, and I had my name right. I had most of the details right, and it really grabbed my attention. About 2 weeks after class, I was talking with a guy in the class. He was a very educated guy, professional guy, and very gracious. He said, "Hey, I really enjoyed the lesson a couple of weeks ago, and I appreciate you talking about, telling us that story you told us. But actually, there was one detail that's wrong. It was actually this." And I thought, wow, people are listening, and they're going to check you out. So that's critically important. Well. In the end of the introduction, goes back to what you said, Gaidi. He references the Google-fueled, Wikipedia-based collapse of the division between the professional or the expert and the lay people, the student and the teacher. So you have people saying, well, I don't need to go to seminary. I mean, teachers, whatever those teachers can teach me, I can find it out myself. I'll Google it. I'll Wikipedia it, And so there's this collapse, hence in his title, The Attack on Established Knowledge. So, we're just coming now out of the introduction, but, on the basis of what he provides in the introduction, do you think he makes a decent case for his argument that we are experiencing in some sense, and of course he qualifies it, the death of expertise? Or do you think he's just coming up with a cool topic to write a book about? What's your observation?
Well, I think he's good. I think he meets his goal in that the title itself is capturing, and it kind of bespeaks what he's trying to get over. I want to, and I think about it, I always think about books, and when I require reading in the context of how I can use it and how I can help the people to whom I preach, and just kind of looking. I've seen it seems like there's a desire, an innate desire for people to be considered experts, even amongst clergy. Now, one of the things that I've seen a lot is this business of honorary doctorate, and I don't have a problem with that. But people presented themselves as though they've labored in academia. And I don't want to, be like I'm way up here and they're down here. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, why do that if there's not a desire amongst many to be considered an expert?
Yep.
So I mean, even in preaching, he'll throw it out, Doctor so, and nobody's going to check it if his subject agrees with his verb. He has a reasonable handle of the English language. Nobody's going to check it out. Most of the time they won't. Sometimes they will. These younger people will, but a lot of the 50 and above probably won't.
Yeah, that just underscores the idea that preachers are still sinners like everybody else, and that underscores his argument that we all really would like to be known as experts.
Yeah.
And if we can get titles or things attached to our name, and it's pretty easy to do so, then hey, that's great. And I understand the honorary doctorate thing, and I'm like you, Gotti. I have no problem with it. And I've often told PhD students, if the reason you're doing a PhD is to be able to be called doctor one day, that's a really poor reason.
Sure.
Really poor. The bottom line is you do the degree because in our case, you feel the Lord bringing, like Fermata was talking about, the Lord gives you conviction, clear leadership that he wants you to go down this road, and you realize, hey, it's going to deepen you, it's going to mature you, it's going to provide more discipline for you. And I remember dealing with that. I had, when I determined I was going to pursue the PhD, I had people say, "Why would you do that? You just want a pastor." And I said, "Well, I really feel like that doing a PhD will give me a discipline and a perspective that I can't create on my own." And it certainly did. It gave me a perspective I could guarantee you I wouldn't have had otherwise, regardless of how disciplined I might have been. Well, it goes on in this.
Dr. McKellar, may I just throw this just before I forget?
Yeah.
When you, in your context where you are the Sunday school teacher at your church, and you mentioned the level of professionals that are there, how would they perceive you if you didn't hold a PhD?
Well, it's fascinating. I've been teaching this class for 6+ years now, and the guy that taught it for the 6 years preceding me was a guy named Jeffrey Bingham. So, as in Dr. Bingham, who's the dean of the School of Theology at Southwestern. So, they're used,
sure.
they're used to people with education. But I would say in their defense, one thing I found out pretty clearly, these people have a real, I'm not saying every one of them, I don't know their heart, but for the most part, the folks in the class have a real hunger, for scripture, a hunger for the word of God. And they're not particularly impressed by, high sounding words. I found out they just love the scriptures, and my job is not to try to impress them with my learnedness. It's to deliver the goods and to do it in an accurate way. But your point's well taken, Gaidi. I mean, I think I've never had this discussion with him, but I'm pretty sure that after Dr. Bingham left to go to Wheaton College and they needed a new teacher, I'm sure they probably felt, well, we've had Dr. Bingham. It would be great to have another, if we could get another seminary professor, or, that would be great. So I think that's probably was the mindset. So you're right on.
Yeah.
But what you see toward the end of this introduction, guys, he makes the argument that Americans increasingly believe that everyone is as smart as everyone else. And that goes back to what Gaidi said earlier, my truth. Who are you to tell me this is, we're seeing the erasure, we're seeing the blurring of the lines between absolute truth and subjective truth, a rejection of authority. And so people, you probably had them say to you, have had them say to me, well, I'm glad that works for you, but the Oprah thing, that's my truth. You've got, you can define and change your truth along the way. There's no fixed standard. last thing I want to mention before we get to chapter 1, and this, to me, this is really, really spot on, even though the book is written in 2017. He laments the fact that there's this gap, there's this distrust, there's this resistance. I don't need to listen to any expert. I can find that information out for myself, fueled by Wikipedia, fueled by Google, and I agree with him. But he says, or writes, and I think he's absolutely accurate. Today, the problem is not only is there resistance to expertise or authority, but when there is reliance on that authority or reliance on that expertise, it happens increasingly without any meaningful dialogue, which goes back, Gaidi, and I don't want to get off track here, but goes back, Gaidi, to a conversation I think we had in the preaching seminar. That the problem today, I mentioned the lack of civility, the breakdown in terms of true truth, as Schaeffer called it. The result is there's no dialogue. People aren't talking to each other. A disagreement means that you disrespect me. A disagreement is seen as an insult. And I think this is absolutely the case politically. I think it's at the core of our racial tensions. Because I found, for me personally, and I'm grateful for my the different ethnicities, one of the greatest blessings to me in working with not only MDiv students, but particularly THM and PhD students, is that I have students that are African American, African, they're from Nigeria, like Paul. They're Americans with a Hispanic background, like Fermato. I got people from India, I got people from Germany, Korea, China. And so that's been a great blessing. But particularly with my African American brothers, in my talking, with you, Gaidi, and it's been a while back, but with my friend, Andre Kirkland, yeah, and my African American brothers, that's what you guys always come back to, and I think it's crucial. We got to be able to sit down in a room in a civil way and say, man, Matthew, I love you, and you're my friend, you're my fellow brother in Christ, but here's what I think you don't understand about race relations in America. You need to understand the perspective of the Black person in America who lived through the civil rights era and on into today. And likewise, an Anglo needs to be willing to say, hey, Gaidi, this is my perspective, and you need to understand this is where I'm coming from. Because of our current culture, that dialogue, you name the area, and it's not happening because there's such resentment and suspicion and distrust. And we got to get back to that, don't we?
Well, you absolutely, you hit it right on the head. One of our books for the comprehensive exams is this preaching in variety authors. Well, that's how I look at this. We have one Bible, the author would argue, written in different genres, history, Psalms, poetry, whatever it is, all come together to make the Word of God. Well, that's how it is. It should be. And just because you're the Psalms and I'm Ecclesiastes or the history, it shouldn't be we're fighting one another. So if you can publish what you just said and get it out there on the masses, I think we'd be better off. We ought to be able to talk and say, hey, I didn't look at it from that perspective. But that's not what's going on. It's if you disagree, hey, I'm gonna label you, whatever camp I want to label you.
Yeah, if you don't agree with my opinion,
Yeah.
and you don't share my preferences, then you're not as spiritual, you're tone deaf, you're, insert the insult. Right. And I think we're seeing that. So
got to do better.
I think this overall for me is it's not that I came away with any new big insight or revelation. I just found myself reading this going, yes, I see that. I understand that. Yes. Well, we got about 10 minutes left. So let's go into let's go into chapter 1, experts and citizens. He really begins to pick up this idea. We're a nation of explainers, and sometimes a lot of people think are convinced that they are more informed than the experts. He makes a reference to the sitcom Cheers and the character Cliff on there. You know, there's always people who they may have zero formal education, may never have gotten beyond high school. They read or watch or listen to sources incessantly, but their sources are very limited and all from one point of view. And then they go on to essentially say to others, look, I don't need the experts. I can do the study myself. Studies have shown, but then you probe into what their studies are, and you'll see a very narrow perspective. And again, I'm not picking on any political persuasion. I'm just saying I personally know people. To this moment, I know people that wake up in the morning and they turn on Fox News and it's their primary source of information. I also know people that do the same with CNN. Well, are there some messages coming from Fox that are accurate? Well, yeah, CNN, same thing. But is there a lot of grandstanding? Is there a lot of massaging of the information? Absolutely. So I would say that if your primary source of information about which you process life is television news, network news, wow, you're asking for immediate self-impoverishment. Not saying don't watch those outlets, but I'm just saying you've got to get the big perspective. And that's part of your theological education. On the one hand, we don't want to go down the road of liberalism, where competing conclusion cancels out competing conclusions. But I think you would agree part of your MDiv and now advanced education is it makes you look and understand why people thought this. Just like Gaidi, what you're doing in our other seminar. You're studying Furman, not to say, man, this guy was a complete reprobate. He was a slave owner, blah, blah, blah. No, from an educated standpoint, you're going in and saying, this guy is a gifted white man preacher, but he obviously had this glaring blind spot with regard to slavery. What caused him to do that? What about the times in which you're not trying to justify him nor celebrate him. You're trying to understand the brother, That's what you're trying to do. And that's a part of your theological education. For instance, Karl Barth, man, what a theologian, did a great service to believers. You had complete liberalism and basically higher criticism, left things in a shambles in Europe, and he tries to reclaim in a real sense the authority of Scripture. As we would say, though, he just didn't go far enough, did he?
That's right.
But once again, part of your education, you learn to disagree, or you should learn to disagree respectfully. To be able to say, well, Formato, I just listened to what you said, and I just have to disagree with it, and here's why, 1, 2, 3. And to have a conversation without raised voices. And at the end of that conversation, Formato doesn't take anything I've said as an attack on his character, as an insult, but we just have an honest disagreement based on our perspective or our perception of the facts in the case. So I think if you get nothing else out of this book, it is a reminder that if you're going to live in a civil society where there's the meaningful interchange of information and knowledge that can help people, then a lack of civility is just going to clog things up. And that's really where we are, politically, socially, pretty much across the board. Well, what do y'all think about, he quotes this, I like this quote, I'm glad you mentioned it on page 14, from Robert Heinlein, who said, specialization is for insects. This idea that, man, now because we've got Wikipedia, we've got Google, Americans don't need to know everything about every minute subject. They need to have a broad understanding. And I remember hearing much of that argument years ago. Well, you may want to study theology, do a PhD in preaching, but out there on the front lines, the pastor has to be a CEO. He's got to know something about business. He's got to know something about theology, da 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 da, which is true. But that was used with me as a discouragement. You don't want to specialize. Essentially, everybody's an expert. And so today, I see that. I see what he's writing about. We want to be these broad-based generalists, and if I'm not a particular expert in that area, well, I'll just Google it. But as we know, there are limitations to Google and Wikipedia, aren't there? For sure. Yeah. Well, crucial, he writes, in this whole process, and I think this is really important for how you and I relate to expertise, and hopefully, by virtue of, we're going to talk about this later, by virtue of where you are educationally, probably a lot of people in your life, or at least some people in your life, view you as an expert. It may be a family member that knows, oh man, cousin Gaidi over there, I know he's in seminary, I'll call him up. And I get that from relatives. Hey, I know you teach in seminary, I've had this question. You may not be a world-renowned expert, but you're an expert in the immediate circle. And so you see that. Page 15, if we're going to have civility, if we're going to sit down and dialogue, it demands, doesn't it, that we admit the limits of our knowledge.
Yeah.
I don't know everything. I got to be willing to say, in this context, not to beat a horse, but I got to be willing to say, Gaidi, I know some things about Black history. I know some things about the history of African Americans in the United States. I know some history about the slave trade, but I don't know everything. And so I'd like to learn more. Let's go to lunch and talk about it.
Yeah.
Those kind of things aren't, and it's not just race. I'm telling you across the board, that's not happening, which I might also add, guys, that's one reason I love my students. I love the seminary community, because we can get in these smaller classes and seminars and read books and say, hey, let's talk about this. Do you see those connections? And the things that you guys share, help me and give me perspective on the younger generation, because, as an increasingly old man, I want to understand, what are the guys in their 20s and 30s thinking? That what is that pastor out there who's 45 years old? What's he dealing with? So that's crucial. We don't want to admit the limits of our own knowledge, because to do so, he writes, would offend our own sense of autonomy and authority. Now, guys, we'll talk about this more next week, but however you say his name, Alex de Tocqueville, however you want to say his name, I don't agree with everything he's written, but I think he's on target when he says democracy, and I'm paraphrasing, democracy almost invites questioning, almost invites suspicion of the truth. You think about what this country was founded on. You go back to 1776 and you have the American Revolution, the problem with the overarching or overreaching governance of the British, and whatever one's perspective is there, that's how the founders of this country felt. They wanted to have their own autonomy, and our very form of government invites people to say, hey, I don't like that. Hey, I don't agree with that. Hey, I think there's a better way. Now, that's one of the things that makes this country, with all of its warts and problems, a wonderful place to live, that kind of freedom. But at the same time, take the depravity of man and take man's desire to be, his celebrity preoccupation, to be at the top, all that stuff, and mix all that together, and you have the incivility that we have today, don't you? You really do. I love this on page 16, and we'll end with this. This is guys, a sermon illustration. Imagine what the 1920s would have sounded like if every crank in every small town had his own radio station. And I thought about that today. You know, you and I and everybody else that has access to an iPhone or a computer, we really have our own radio station, our own broadcasting company. We can get off this class and Paul Atagoke can get on his iPhone. He doesn't have to get on his computer, and he can write a message and he can send it, and it can be seen in 20 seconds worldwide, and he can communicate whether he's an expert or not. And I see this phenomenon today. I've known some young men, very very gifted, but very early in their seminary education, and they are blogging or they are on social media profusely addressing every theological argument, which I have no problem at. But I do have a problem when I see them obviously aiming to convey the idea that they are the expert in the subject. So now you can go on social media and create the narrative, and you can be a 2.8 MDiv student, but on social media, you're cranking yourself out as the ultimate academician, and unfortunately, I see that. So I just thought that was a great picture. Well, we're about out of time today, but I want us to come back and talk about the rest of the book, because there's just so many rich things in there. Leaves us with so many things to think about. Well, we miss the guys who were not able to be with us today. Hope they'll be able to watch the recording. I think this Nichols book is important. In practical reasoning, we're making arguments. We're presenting evidence. And, Formato, you touched on this. In some ways, it's easier to present the evidence now than it's ever been because we have all this information. But in other ways, that evidence, at least at the outset, is less convincing to people because the culture we live in. Well, that's my truth. Where that's your truth. There's no agreed upon objective authority. So very, very interesting book. We'll come back and talk about it again next time. Before we go, any questions about the assignments, the reading, the argumentative briefing that you're working on, as well as the paper? Any questions? Awesome. My trusty friend, Paul Atagoke, will you have anything to add before we go?
No, I just apologize. I've been having a lot of internet connection issues, laptop problems, and all that.
Well, that is no problem. We still love you, Paul, and even the best guys sometimes have some technical difficulties. So we sure understand that. Hey guys, it's going to get really cold, so y'all be sure and stay warm and probably stay off the roads if that's at all possible, and be safe. And I'll see you here on Zoom next Tuesday. But we'll continue to study the book. Now, I'll just give you a quick warning. I talked way too much, way more than I wanted to. When we come back on Tuesday, I'm going to have a series of questions, and you guys are going to mix it up. So come with your gun loaded. I want you coming in hot. All right. Thank y'all. Have a great weekend. See you next time.
Dr. McKellar?
Yes, sir.
I was going to ask, when will you be in school so I could get the recording to be able to work on it?
Yeah.
Do you have any plans to be in school anytime soon?
Yeah. Before all this weather, I plan to be in chapel next Wednesday, and I have a faculty meeting next Wednesday. But it may not be until then, but that could change. But I could certainly connect with you sometime on Wednesday. Would that work?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I'll just send a message to the guys that this class would be delayed in posting.
Yeah, that's
so
fine.
That yeah. All right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. My plan right now, and if I'm going to be there before then, I'll let you know. But for sure on Wednesday. All right.
All right. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else, guys, before we go? Awesome. Y'all have a great weekend. See you next Tuesday.